start the recording now.
Okay, thanks very much for the invite. So I don't know how you usually do this, but feel free to ask questions during the seminar if that's okay. I mean, I'm fine to just jump in and try and explain if there's anything that is urgent. All right, so I'm going to talk about some of the physics that we've been working on recently, specifically understanding the superconducting phases in the neutron star interior better. As not all of you might be experts in neutron stars, I was just going to give you a little bit of a summary on what neutron stars are, or specifically the elements that we need to sort of understand the microscale superconducting models. And I'll briefly give you like sort of the lowdown on the aspect of superconductivity that we need, and then I'll present some of the recent results that we've been working on. So neutron stars are one type of compact remnant that is essentially created during the final stages of stellar evolution, when a massive star that has something like 8 to 20 or 30 times the mass of our sun runs out of fuel and essentially collapses under its own gravitational attraction. And the layers fall inwards, the outer layers then sort of bounce back. And a lot of this material is thrown out in these massive supernova explosions. On the right-hand side, you can sort of see some of these supernova simulations that people have been doing. You see that there's lots of like turbulent behavior going on and lots of like small scale structures in the end. They're sort of like visible in some sense in the actual supernova remnant, and that's left over at the end. But what we're left with sort of at the center of this entire process is this tiny compact object that's got the size of like a city, and that's sort of like dominated by the presence of neutrons as a result of like a large number of electron captures in the interior of this massive compact object. So they typically have something like the size of a city with a radius of something like 9 to 13 kilometers, but they weigh about 1.2 to 2.2 the mass of our sun. And if you look at these numbers and sort of like extract the density that you can probably reach from that in the center of this object, is something on the order of 10 to the 15, which sort of exceeds what we actually know from the densest material that we know on Earth. As a result of this, we don't actually know what the equation of state at those densities is. So the behavior of matter is not that well understood. We've sort of some ideas, but for like the majority of like the knowledge that we have on the structure, it's more like a canonical understanding than an actual like decider on what's really going on. So for most of the physics that I typically am interested in, I look at what I would call mature neutron stars. So they have something like 10 to the 4 years of age. And at that point, they are sort of in this equilibrium stage where the individual layers that are present have sort of formed and are probably going to stay there. So at that point, the stars have something like temperatures of 10 to the 6 to 10 to the 8 Kelvin. And we have this like formation of distinct layers that are present in the star. So in this sort of cake slice on the right-hand side, you sort of see the most basic one that we can draw. The exact lines and the exact densities are not understood really well. But we sort of have this idea that we have an outer crust that's composed of lattice nuclei, electrons, and neutrons. Then at this line, which is the crust-core interface, we go into the outer core where we have neutrons, protons, electrons, and at some point also muons. And then we have this inner core where I typically draw question marks because we don't actually really know what's happening. There could be exotic particles here and other phases that we actually really don't understand that well. So typically for a lot of like the macroscopic hydrodynamical models that people write down that include superfluidity or superconductivity, I need a crust and a core. And for a lot of the things that I typically work on, I just ignore this with a caveat that this could actually significantly alter our conclusions and our dynamical models. So in this kind of picture with the crust and the core, so I have this two-layer model in principle. I have at least 3 superfluid superconducting components present. So close to the crust-core interface here, I actually have a superfluid neutron component. And in the outer core, the neutrons and the protons are expected to build a quantum state. So typically, when we talk about superfluid and superconducting components in a laboratory context, this is something that happens at relatively low temperatures. People are trying really hard to reduce the temperatures of their cryostates to actually like produce these phases in the millikelvin, microkelvin, nanokelvin range. So in sort of the terms of the temperatures that we have in the Newton stars with 10 to the 6 or 8 Kelvin, they're much, much, much hotter. But they're actually very cold in terms of their nuclear physics, one could say. So the neutrons and the protons in the interior of the Newton star are fermions, and they can actually become unstable to Cooper pair formation due to some kind of attractive contribution to the nuclear-nuclear interaction potential. It's also a function of like where you are in the star. And the whole process is typically described to sort of like first order with the standard microscopic BCS theory that people have also applied to the laboratory systems that form these quantum condensates under similar conditions. So like the most naive like number that one could probably look at to sort of see that this is important is the Fermi temperature of the system. So if I look at the nucleons, so the neutrons and the protons, Fermi temperature is something like the order of 10 to the 12 Kelvin, which is much, much, much hotter than the actual ambient temperature of the star, which sort of tells us that if we really want to understand what's happening on like different scales, we have to sort of like figure out how quantum mechanics actually affects the system. So in principle, other people, I typically use these results as input for my calculations, have calculated these actual like energy gaps that are associated with the formation of these condensates. So on the left-hand side here, you can see some of these typical gaps. There's a lot of different options available in the literature. I've just sort of picked randomly some that people on the astrophysics community sometimes use. So you see that there's 4 curves here. So we have, first of all, this blue dashed curve, which is the superfluid in the inner crust. That's the singlet state paired system. And typically like the energy gaps have like maxima that range from something between 1 to sometimes even 2.5 or 3 MeV, and a sort of similar area of like 1 over Fermi for the Fermi wave number. So we sort of like have some kind of like characteristic energy gap. And what's sometimes more interesting for the astrophysics community is actually what does that translate to in terms of the temperature of the system. So you can translate this into a critical temperature of the system by using a standard BCS expression. And if you have an equation of state, you can plot this as a function of the actual like mass energy density for the system, for example. So if you imagine the star initially being hot, you sit somewhere up here. The core is typically relatively isothermal. So you can imagine like this like line of temperature moving downwards as the star cools. So you first hit like this critical temperature, and then you will hit the other critical temperatures dependent on what the energy gaps actually are on a microscopic picture. So in the core you see, just I'm typically focusing on the core, is you hit first the transition temperature for the protons. So in this picture, this corresponds to the light blue gap curve, which is also something on the order of 1 MeV to something that's maybe like factor of 3 smaller, depending on the models that you look at. And then eventually, once you cool down even further, you'll hit the superfluid transition temperature for the core neutrons. And you see that I've given you 2 models here. Those are in principle the same system, but there's much more uncertainty even associated with these, because at high densities, you really have to like understand much better what your nuclear interactions are to actually get this translated properly. So there's much more variety, I would say, in these models and their maximum amplitudes and their maxima, where they are actually much less uncertain. So for a lot of the physical models that people like write down, if I model, for example, what's called pulsar glitches, or even like these kind of superconducting phase considerations, it really depends on what you want to do. So if you model superfluid macroscopic behaviors, typically what I care about is just, am I below this line or not? So very often I don't actually need the exact shape of the curve. I just need to know when do I cross it, so I can sort of like model the dynamics. If you want to model cooling per se, you need to know when you are above this line or below, because different mechanisms kick in. So there's sort of like some like it's not always necessary to exactly know where the curve is, but you sometimes like really need this like to figure out the exact like time evolution of a system. Okay, so for a lot of the things that I will talk about, we typically assume that the entire core is in this condensate state, and we actually only need the gaps to sort of like determine some of the microscopic quantities of the system, specifically the coherence length. But in principle, like I can work with any curve that people give me, but I do need this as an input for my actual model. All right, so a few words on superconductivity. So as everyone likely knows, superconductors are systems that have vanishing electrical resistivity, resistance. So they're basically perfect conductors, and they exhibit Meissner effect. So they expel their magnetic flux. And sort of from like the earliest time these systems of materials were discovered, they were essentially studied by applying an external field and looking what the system does as a response, which essentially tells us something about the internal magnetization of the problem. So historically, dependent on the response of the system, we distinguish two types, type 1 and type 2 media, whereas in the type 1 system, we sort of like have this as a function of the applied magnetic field. We essentially have like an increase, you can ramp up the field, and at some point superconductivity breaks down at one single value. Whereas the case of these type 2 media, this sort of like happens like gradually, and in this case where I sit between the field HC1 and HC2, I have like a continuous decrease in the flux overall. So this is the range where I actually have flux tubes present in the interior. And so historically, there's these two types of theories that people use to describe this. So there's BCS theory on one hand, but it was actually like more useful very often for like the analysis of like the macroscopic behavior is the Ginzburg-Landau theory, which is relatively useful at describing the features of the system close to the transition temperature. Okay, so from a phenomenological point of view, this actually gives us a much better handle of like modeling like very complicated system where I could never really like provide a microscopic description from first principles. But obviously we want to link this sort of back and see if that's consistent. Okay, so how does this connect to the neutron star interior? So I've titled this the old type 2 picture, because this is sort of the idea that people have in their minds when people talk about neutron star superconductivity, that stems from the seminal paper from Biompathic and Pint from 1969, where they essentially argued that the conductivity in the neutron star matter, even in the normal case, is so high that as you go through this transition from the normal case to the superconducting case, the timescales to expel the flux, so to like actually exhibit Meissner effect, are incredibly long, something on the order of the age of the universe. So in principle, even if the neutron star wants to like undergo this transition, it's got no time to like really expel the flux. And the transition actually has to happen at like flux being present in the interior of the system. So the neutron star in this picture is sort of in this metastable state where it wants to expel flux, but it just can't because the timescales for that are too long. And in their paper, they like used a very simple argument based on a single component classical superconductor to sort of look at, in the presence of this flux, what do I actually get microscopically by looking at the different length scales that are involved in the system. So they just calculated the ratio of the London penetration depth to the coherence length of the flux tube, and they found that for the outer core, this is larger than the standard critical value that we also know from laboratory systems, which they used to conclude that the outer neutron star core is actually in a flux tube type 2 state, which is sort of illustrated in the simple decoration image here on the left-hand side. So you have these like quantized structure, everything that's dark is normal conducting, everything that's white is flux free. Okay. In principle, you can use standard sort of like textbook expressions to calculate what the lower critical field and the upper critical field is. And you see that they're sort of on the order of 10 to the 14 Gauss to 10 to the 15 Gauss for neutron star matter. And in principle, a lot of like neutron stars actually have fields that are lower than this value. But the problem is this like metastability that they in principle don't, even if they want to be fully flux free, they don't have the time to actually like drive the flux tube out. over like reasonable timescales that we can use to observe it. So they're kind of stuck in this metastable state where the outer core looks like this.
Sorry, Vanessa, can I ask a question here?
Yes.
So I just want to make sure that I understand what you're saying. So you're saying that this magnetic field somehow becomes trapped inside the neutron star and it cannot be expelled until in a very long time.
That's the picture that they had in mind.
So what confuses me is that I would have thought that the higher the conductivity, the more efficient the system is at expelling the magnetic field. But maybe I'm missing the time scale here.
I think like, so you can just write down a really simple, so basically it's like the inverse calculation of a calculation that Pepper did in like the 1950s, I think, to sort of calculate the timescales for flux expulsion. And the timescales that you essentially get out is something that scales with B over H C1 squared. So you get sort of like the timescales out of the system that are like incredibly long. And so I think,
is there some physical intuition to understand why it takes so long? Is it because it's very dense material, or why is it?
Yes, so I think like you basically have to look at like the physical mechanism that gives you like the dominant contribution to like the conductivity in the case of normal matter. So that's like actually the quantity that enters the system. And if you look at that and put that into the estimate of the calculation, you find that like you actually can't rearrange flux as easily as you would want to.
Right, but is the physical reason that this is a very high density?
Yes, I think that's the number. Like, yeah, that's the quantity that enters the system. Yeah. So in the case of the Newton star interior, like your composition is so extreme that the actual like physical driver for like rearrangement flux is not fast enough to like give you anything on observable timescales.
I see. So is it correct to think of this metastable state as a, strictly speaking, metastable, but with a, with a lifetime, with an average lifetime longer than the age of the universe? So it's for all practical purposes stable, or?
Yes. Yeah. So like what basically gives you like the actual evolution in this picture is like that these flux tubes are repulsive. So in principle, like what they want to do is like increase the actual separation between them over time until none are left. So in a laboratory system, this actually also happens if you like have some kind of like seeds that give you these flux structures. But in a laboratory system, you can actually expel them on observable timescale. So there's some systems where this takes like minutes. So people have actually monitored this, like when people started doing these kind of experiments. But in the case of the Newton star, this timescale is actually incredibly long.
I see. Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. So if this picture like sort of holds, things are somewhat easy if you want to like model macroscopic hydrodynamics, because what you can actually do is you can just count how many you have per unit area to give you X amount of magnetic induction. So if I, for example, know that I know what the matter is made of, basically. So I know that each of these flux tubes carries a magnetic flux quantum, then I can just add them all up and tell you that if I want to reach like typical values of the magnetic induction are 10 to the 12, that I need 10 to the 18 flux tubes per square centimeters. Okay. So from like a macroscopic like field perspective, that's almost like, well, does it really matter that it's quantized, because I can just average over this whole picture. And that's typically what people do. So they use these like flux tube, or in the case of the superfluid, it's a lot less, but like people have used this like to actually write down vortex or flux tube averaged equations, because I can basically do that. Okay, and the only thing that I then have to account for is what are the additional physics that are present because of the structures that are actually there. But I then can again like include this into some kind of like vortex or flux tube average picture to actually write down equations. So what that actually sort of means for field evolution is much less obvious, because if I really want to describe the system properly, I just don't have just Euler equations, but I need something to close the Euler equations, essentially, which is what's referred to typically in like the standard MHD sense as an induction equation. So I need some equation that describes how the field evolves if I really want to solve these equations properly. And in principle, in this, I'm going to say simple picture, if I move flux tubes around, or if I have effects that move these flux tubes around, like this like super long expulsion due to their repulsive interaction, I can in principle write down an equation that sort of like gives me like the dominant effect that drives magnetic field evolution in this picture. Okay. I just said that the actual repulsion is really long, but there's other effects that we know affect these flux tubes. Specifically, sort of the standard picture that people had in mind is that actually the electrons, which are also there, can scatter off the quasi-particles that are present in the center of these flux tubes, and you have some kind of resistive interaction between the two. And we sort of thought that this is the dominant mechanism, and you can use like standard MHD techniques to actually derive a superconducting induction equation. And you find that you can write down an equation that looks like something like this. It doesn't really matter exactly what the details are, but if you sort of like know how the standard induction equation looks like, you find that it has inertial terms. It's got a Hall-like conservative term and a dissipative ohmic-like term that sort of depends on two quantities, this curly B prime and B prime, which is essentially like effectively encoding this coupling on a microscale. So B is just the magnetic induction in the vector quantity here. So in principle, I can control these by like the microscopic physics again. So if I want to like model the system as a whole, I need some kind of like macroscopic average, and that's essentially what we managed to derive. But if you put in the numbers for this mechanism, this electron scattering, you actually find that this is still on the order of 10 to the 9 or 10 to the 11 years, which is still really like not giving you anything on like observable timescales, which is something that people have suggested is required to sort of explain like activity in neutron stars, or like actually get their evolution, which is like something that had to be on the order of 10 to the 4 or 10 to the 6 years. Okay, so in principle, this is what people, what I've also been involved in doing, because this is sort of the canonical picture that we have in hand. But there's one sort of like obvious thing that if you look at this model, that is not correct. And the reason for that is that our sort of like understanding of this macroscopic superconducting picture in the Neutron star case is based on single component considerations. So people just use the single component Ginzburg-Landau model, just really textbook expressions. And they didn't like kind of consider this in a time dependent picture, but everything is like a ground state consideration. So we don't really actually know what happens in the stellar interior at different densities if we include the coupling between the protons and the neutrons, and actually what happens as the star goes dynamically through the transition temperature. Okay? So we don't really understand what the superconducting phase diagram looks like, or how the superconducting phase is actually formed. So what we focused on is not the time dependent part for now, but we actually focused on also an equilibrium consideration. But we looked at what actually entrainment, so this coupling between the neutrons and the protons in the interior as a result of these high densities, are actually doing to this like quantum state. Okay, so we sort of like picked up on earlier works that have looked at this, but we sort of wanted to do this through the entire neutron star core to get like a little bit of a picture of what actually happens macroscopically for different densities, and sort of look at like what happens to the superconducting protons if I apply a magnetic field and I were positioned at different densities in the star. So that was the main motivator for this paper that we wrote, and we've been working on for quite a while. But essentially what I'm going to show you as a summary is phase diagrams for the superconducting state as a function of B and the density. So that's what we want to get to. All right, so the first thing that we did is sort of like generalize some of the earlier considerations that people had done that were not fully Galilean and baryon on microscopic scales. So if we really want to write down a proper microscopic model and connect that to some kind of like equation of state that we had access to, we needed a full Galilean and baryon expression. And sort of like the simplest way to write this down is we require that our velocity dependent terms look like this. So these are just the superfluid velocities and the particle densities. And the velocities are actually related to the canonical momenta in the system. So we have basically like a 2-order parameter system where we have 2 wave functions, one for the neutrons and one for the protons. And if we actually wanted to recover a term like this, consistently including different terms into the mean field framework is only possible if we include 4th order terms in psi n and psi p and 2nd order in their derivatives. So essentially what this means is we need terms that like are sums of all of these individual contributions. Okay, so we have like a huge page-long energy density, and if we require that things are eventually supposed to look like this, we can essentially simplify the sum in a specific way, which we basically did, and we needed this step to actually be able to link this to some of the nuclear physics models that we wanted to use. So this entrainment, or this density-dependent coupling term, is then the standard term that we added on to the standard free energy of a 2-component superconductor. And we've also introduced the magnetic field using minimal coupling. So if you're sort of familiar with this from your work or your courses, so the first 2 lines are essentially like the standard Ginzburg-Landau energy that you have for a 2-component system. So you have individual terms that depend on the density squared. Then there's a coupling term between the individual densities. And then there's the standard term terms as a result of the magnetic field present, essentially. Now, the last 2 lines are essentially the 2 free individual contributions that we get because we include entrainment type of coupling. Okay, so we have 3 different quantities, H1 and H2 and H3, that we kind of need to find an estimate for at any given density in the star. Okay, so basically we want to like, so this is the energy that we want to minimize to find the ground state of the system. And in principle, people in the past have only used some of these H terms. But if we really want to do this consistently, and like, I can't just, I mean, there's no specific reason why I would just use the H1 term and not the H3 term if they sort of contribute at the same order. And we do actually see that we need them all to sort of get the full picture. And so what we basically did is we used the connection to the Skyrme interaction and used the full Skyrme model to determine the stellar composition at a given density by solving the standard equations. And on top of that, use a separate description for the gap to determine all these coefficients at a given density. So you see that obviously like there's no higher order terms in here that you would have in your standard Skyrme model, but they're actually like not really that necessary to like give you like the actual composition of the superconducting phase. Okay, so we basically have the stellar structure based on the Skyrme model as the background, and at each density we solve this system of equation that you get from this energy density. So if you are familiar with the Skyrme coefficients, what you see is like that you can actually write H1 and H2 exactly in terms of the standard coefficients. So for any given Skyrme model that you would give me, I can calculate what the coefficients are, and then we can solve this. And we also recovered one of the earlier results that actually this H1 coefficient is really crucial for what people typically refer to as the entrainment parameter, which is the term that we had here that sort of like controls what the actual like interaction is if I have like relative flow between the 2 particles or between the 2 condensate species. Okay, so we did this for, I mean, I said we can do this for any Skyrme model, in principle also any kind of gap parameterization. We focused on one set of gaps, and we used 6 different Skyrme models that sort of had like a relatively large spread in these numbers, just to see how extreme can we actually make our phase diagrams. So basically what we do is we then try and find the ground state of the system by imposing a magnetic field. And if you think of this idea of like finding the ground state, you can make kind of 2 types of thought experiments. And this is something that we actually looked at quite a while, because it's not that obvious in the classical like system where you have a laboratory superconductor, you have like a magnetic field that's produced by two coils and you put the sample in the middle. So what's basically like the two options that you have, like considering the ground state, are either by like imposing an actual magnetic flux density. So you have a mean flux that's confined into the sample, or you have the sample and you have an external thermodynamic critical field that you apply. Okay. So the second option is like the option that people are more familiar with. So also the quantity that I showed you earlier on the magnetization plots is H. But in the Newton star case, I don't actually apply an external field in that sense, but I have flux stuck in the system. So I'm sort of like closer in the Newton star case if I approximate this by this thought experiment 1. Okay. So I'm just going to show you one of the plots for the single component superconductors, just to sort of like visualize what's actually happening, because this picture on the left-hand side with H is much easier for us to sort of understand as the picture with B. So this is H as a function of kappa and the mean flux as a function of kappa. And you sort of see if I'm, so this is all normalized, but you see sort of like if I have low fields, I'm always in the Meissner regime. If I am at this critical point of 1 over the square root of 2, I have this triple point where I can then branch off into the case where I have an HC2 and an HC1. So the curves that I showed you earlier were essentially slices this way and this way. Okay, so this is the picture where I have H as the control parameter. So I have first order phase transition here. So I like abruptly change the magnetization. And I have second order phase transitions here where I sort of like have this flux state in the middle to sort of like mediate this transition. So if I were to go into the B picture, I have never the case where I have no flux unless I'm really on the x-axis here. So the picture is sort of like that for every single mean flux, if I'm above the critical value, I have to have flux tube somewhere. I cannot like not have flux, but they will have a different separation dependent on what my value of B is until I go above the critical field, because B, we use CGS units, so B and H have the same value. From above that, I just have a normal conducting matter again. But now in the type 1 regime, essentially, so this bit here, I have to put flux into the system by having this intermediate state where I have macroscopic regions that carry flux and others that are flux free. And that's actually the sort of picture that I showed you earlier. I should have moved this, which is sort of like something that looks like this. So in this case, this is an intermediate type 1 regime where I have white is again flux free and the black bits carry magnetic flux. So I have this like sort of like labyrinth or lamella type structure where these two macroscopic regions alternate. So this is exactly the picture that I would have in a single component superconductor. So in the case of the Neutron side, we would expect this to obviously be more complicated because we will have two systems. But what we essentially did is try and reproduce the exact same picture, but for the interior matter for the different equations of state. So what we do is we solve the Euler-Lagrange equations that are coming out of the energy density I showed you earlier, and we do this with quasi-periodic boundary conditions, so we can sort of simulate in principle a large sample. And what that means is we essentially specify the number of flux tubes or magnetic flux quanta we have for a certain area, which also allows us to actually in principle compare like different lattice structures, so whether you have a square lattice or a hexagonal lattice. And then we calculate the Helmholtz free energy for a given magnetic flux quantum for unit length in principle. So we have a 2D model, not a 3D model at this point. And what comes out at every given density for every given equation of state is a plot like this on the left-hand side here. Okay, so we plot this energy, which essentially average over this entire like unit cell that we look at as a function of A. A is essentially the area per magnetic flux quantum, which you can sort of like think of as the Wigner side cell of a magnetic flux quantum. This is given by 2 pi over this B. So large A corresponds to small flux and small a corresponds to a lot of flux. So you sort of see that like this is the normal superconductor here. And at some point I like if I have a low enough field, I can move into the superconducting flux tube system. And if you had a normal type 2 superconductor, what you would have is that the actual minimum of the system would be at infinity. So the actual energy would look something like this. So you would just continuously monotonously decrease until you like reach that the minimum at infinity, which is essentially what the superconductor does. So in the flux tube case, we just like at some very large separation, in principle at infinity, make 2 flux tubes, and as you like have more and more flux tubes, you make the flux tube separation become smaller and smaller, which is in principle the inverse that I mentioned earlier from like having flux tube expulsion in this metastable state at like very long time scale. But we sort of see that there's actually like a minimum of the curve, which is sort of telling us that the actual like flux tubes like to appear at some kind of like preferred separation. So this is basically like some A, which corresponds to some minimum flux that the individual flux tubes like to appear at. So the thing is like, so typically in the type 2, in a normal type 2 case, this is just a non-convex function. And every time we have some kind of non-convexity, there's actually ways that the system can rearrange itself in a way to minimize its energy that's not just a normal array. This sounds a little bit weird, but what you can show is that if you have a sufficiently large computational domain, you actually get these inhomogeneous ground states that are associated with these regions of the curve where I can have like basically area underneath the curve. Okay, so this is basically somewhere here. You can sort of see this great line that sort of delimits this region, and this is somewhere here. So what does this actually mean? So in principle, the pure hexagonal lattice would be a possible state of the system, but it's not actually the ground state. So the system can minimize its energy further by having like parts of the system in a lattice state and part not in a lattice state. So in the case of this left dot here, what I essentially get is a mixture of non-superconductor and flux tube. If you've never seen these rainbow diagrams before, what they essentially tell us is dark is very much like in the decoration picture earlier, is normal or carries flux. And these rainbow parts are basically the white bits from earlier. So they are the flux sphere regions, but this actually shows you the phase. So this shows you, this encodes the phase of the order parameter. So everywhere where we see color, we essentially have no normal matter present. Okay, so this is sort of like a snapshot of the system where I have a mixture of normal area and flux tube system. And this is the system where I have Meissner state mixed with flux tube. Okay, so I have like not a pure lattice state, but I can mix this, and you see that these actually correspond to the 2 red dots. So they have a lower energy overall than the actual lattice state, which is given by this curve. So the system can minimize its energy by building these kind of intermediate homogeneous states, one could say. All right, so essentially what this happens if I have these mixed states is that the second order phase transitions that I would typically have are replaced by first order phase transitions at different fields. And we can calculate these critical fields partially semi-analytically, partially numerically from the curves that I just showed you. It's a little bit of a hassle, but in principle, we can do this at each density and construct these phase diagrams for the superconducting state throughout the neutron star core. So this is one example for the LNS equation of state. So this is the picture with H again, and this is the picture with B. So you sort of see that there is first order transitions at some bits close to the triple point that if I were to plot this in the B case would then be replaced by these intermediate states to remove the first order transition again. Okay, so this is just a normal flux tube state. This is the standard type 1 intermediate state that we saw earlier as well. This is the non-superconducting state. But because I have these like changing points between HC1 and HC1 prime here and HC2 and HC2 prime here, I have like mixed states that appear between a Meissner and a flux tube state, which is basically Meissner and flux tube state that I showed you here. And this would be flux tube state and normal conductor, which would correspond to this. Okay. So you can reproduce these for different Skyrme models. So again, we can change the coefficient basically in our energy density. And you can see that the functional form overall is kind of similar, but you sort of shift where the triple point is. You shift maybe the transition. For some of them, we don't actually have an HC1 transition at all, which would mean like only for very high fields, you have like a flux tube state at all. For some regions, some Skyrme models, we don't actually find an upper second order transition at all. So there's no HC2 prime field, which means we don't have one of these mixtures between normal and flux tube at all. For some of them, you can't see the triple case. But in principle, like you can sort of like shift the structure quite significantly depending on what your microscopic model is, just because you change the coefficients in the system. It's relatively sensitive to this from like a microscopical point of view. So this might look very different and like sort of like unusual, but in principle, this is something that's actually known from laboratory superconductors. Okay, so I showed you earlier this like simple single component figure from like the type 2 case and the intermediate type 1 case, but there is actually other types of superconductors that people have sort of like discovered in the last decade that also show very unique flux distributions. So these are typically referred to as multi-band superconductors, and you can see an example here on the right-hand side. So you have bits where there is white flux tube array, and then there is like normal matter, non-superconducting matter here. So this is also these kind of like lamella type structures, but the flux carrying part is a flux tube lattice. Okay, so you can sort of see this. And in the laboratory superconductor case, this is typically referred to as type 1.5 superconductivity, sort of like because it has like special features. It's like a mixture of the two in some sense. It's maybe not the best naming convention, but in principle, like microscopically, what happens is that you just have like flux tube repulsion on short scales, but attraction on large scales, which is in principle directly connected again to the fact that I have like some kind of minimum state that is not at infinity. So there is like some repulsion and attraction that sort of like plays together that gives me these like specific orderings to give me these like mixed states. Okay, so for all the models that we did consider, I just said the shift's quite significant, but in principle, from like an astrophysics perspective, for most of the Newton stars that have a field lower than 10 to the 14, there's actually very few type 2 per se, which is the assumption that people have made so far. But there's actually a lot of this type 1.5, where flux is irregularly distributed and actually retained. So this is the ground state. This is not like in the type 2 system where I'm in this metastable state where I want to like at some point like push the flux tubes further and further apart. That's driving something on really long time scales. This actually likes to sit there like this. Okay, so I mainly focused on the outer core. Let me look at this. So this is basically this picture that we have here. But in the inner core, we also have this intermediate type type 1 system, which is like the classic picture, where I also have this kind of mixed state, but it's something that we're a little bit more familiar with. But we can sort of estimate where this transition actually happens. And we also see again that this is like strictly dependent on the actual like entrainment parameter in principle. So you actually see that in this case where we don't have this transition at all, the entrainment parameter, so the HC1 value of our model actually takes on relatively small values. So we sort of like recover like some of the basic features by just looking at this number. So just to sort of like recap again what this means for the flux distribution is, in principle, like this is the picture that you can sort of imagine. So only the very, very, very high field systems would have this like mixture, this like tiny bit of phase where I have flux tube mixing with a non-superconductor. That's probably not applicable for lots of the systems. But a lot of the stars will have like a very small area, if at all, of type 2. Then there will be a lot of mixture of Meissner and flux tube. And then in the inner core, we would have Meissner and normal matter. So if I were to like rotate this, it would look something like this. So I didn't like add the pure flux tube out there, but I would have this transition between individual flux tubes that have a preferred separation. So this is the number we can actually get. This is associated with the minimum of the curve from earlier. We don't know how many there are, and we don't know how much these clusters are actually, like how far they are apart, but we know sort of this distance, and we know that it has to transition into like these macroscopic regions of normal conductivity, okay? just sort of illustrated by this blue thing here. Now a few caveats to this, and I said some of these already. So first of all, we use the Skyrme model, and we assume that it correctly describes the entire interaction for our entire model. Now, if I have any kind of like, if you don't believe this model is correct, or it's not correct at high densities, then this won't be like easily transferable. Also, if you have other exotic particles or other non-nuclear matter states, this is not going to work. So I would say, depending on like where like other like, or how far you want to believe this, I think you probably like, it's not quite exactly clear what's actually happening here. But I think this kind of picture that tells us that we should probably revisit some of our macroscopic models, probably a good hint for us to do this. But what really happens here and how this transition works, so if it's there, I think that's a little bit more uncertain. And I said earlier, we used only one set of superfluid gap models, and we used specifically for the protons, the CCDK gap, and for the neutrons, the TTOA gap, because they're sort of motivated by cooling observations of the supernova, the pulsar that's in the supernova remnant of the supernova remnant Cassiopeia A, but that's inconsistent with the mean field description of our interacting particles. Okay, so you have to keep in mind that that's like two different things in principle. So if you wanted to do this consistently, we would need a consistent description of nuclear matter that could give us the coefficients, and then someone would have calculated the gap. But we don't have access to that right now. And in principle, there could be other gap models that make this look different. We've never actually used different gap models to see how much this shifts. This is something that we also want to look at. But so in principle, there is some inherent inconsistency, but that, I mean, almost every single macroscopic superfluid, every single superfluid Newton star model like has the same issue. So we sort of like stuck at this, and I think this is something where sort of the nuclear community can talk a little bit more with the astrophysics community to try and make some progress on this. One other thing that I said earlier is this is a ground state model. Okay, so there's no time dependence in there. So we haven't really incorporated the actual neutron vortices because we don't have rotation in our system. In principle, we have written down the equations, but they're a little bit more difficult to solve. But if we wanted to really capture the time-dependent physics properly, we need to like see how flux tubes interact with vortices, because we know from like sort of like mesoscopic physics models that that's really important. And we haven't done that yet. We're working on that. One thing that's really difficult to do, and that's also missing, is for a full dynamical model, we actually would also have to include the electrons. But the electrons form a normal fluid, so they're not superconducting, but they're really crucial for the actual like distribution of the magnetic field. So there's another like equation, or actually two, that would enter the system if you want to write down a full time-dependent problem. And it's really not that straightforward how you incorporate a normal component on top of the two quantum states. So we can't just like add other terms into our energy density because they have an inherent different nature. So we sort of like have a simple model that we wrote down, and Toby's currently trying to see if he can actually solve this. But it's really like on a much simpler model is like what are the equations that we actually write down. So this is something that we're currently working on. So I don't know yet how much that would actually shift like the structure of the system, but this is something that we have to keep in mind. All right, conclusions. So just to recap, we have these at least 3 superfluid components in the interior of the star that influence the macroscopic properties of this system. It's pretty difficult to like write down models of their macroscopic nature. So I really like this idea that you use laboratory counterparts to like sort of like develop a better understanding, because I sometimes really need like some intuition to write down an equation. I can't just do that like from first principles from scratch. So we sort of like focus in this work on the connection between the superconductors in the lab and the neutron stars. We've written down this phenomenological 2-component Ginzburg-Landau model and connected it to the Skyrme interaction to determine the ground state of the protons throughout the entire neutron star core. And we sort of find that like these inhomogeneous distributions, which is something that are more difficult to like model from a macroscopic point of view and something that we haven't done, actually persist through the majority of the core. From a like astrophysics perspective, this is really kind of crucial because magnetic field evolution, like this superconducting conduction equation that I wrote down or showed you earlier, is really poorly understood in some sense, but it's also really crucial to like model a lot of like the physics that we see from astronomical observations. So for example, people have seen that sort of like the field in normal pulsars, or the actual like structure of the field with respect to rotation shifts as a function of time. People have sort of invoked this as an explanation for why magnetars are really like showing bursting and flaring activity. You need this like as an input to like actually drive these mechanisms. And there is also a lot of ideas on like linking the evolution of the neutron stars in different classes. So we see different like phenomenological classes basically when we look at their behavior, that there is actually some link between them. And that last point is actually something that I'm working on with Nanda a lot right now. But like, if you want to write down equations, like model how these different phenomena happen, you need to understand better what's actually happening on microscopic scales and need to link these different scales to sort of develop a more consistent model. And that's something that I hope I convinced you is an interesting topic. And that's it. All right.
All right. Thank you, Vanessa, for a fascinating seminar. I have lots of questions, but I'm sure everybody else will also have questions. So I'll open the ground for discussion now. Any questions from the audience?
So I have a question, but maybe it's kind of, I don't know. So you were concerned about the Galilean symmetry at some point?
Yeah.
But I would have thought that this system is relativistic. So is that something you should take into account at some point, perhaps only in the deepest part of the core, or?
That's a very good question. All right, so there is one paper, did I actually write this down? So this paper by Haber and Schmidt specifically, they wrote down a Lorentz invariant model that like focused basically on the whole picture in a relativistic system. They didn't include all the terms that we have. Like, I think they only focus on some of them and specifically looked at like what this density coupling does to the system. They find similar phases overall, but they couldn't link their system to an equational state model that allows them essentially to do this matching of like one model to the Skyrme model that gives you this as a function of density. So yes, in principle, you're correct. Like ultimately, this system should be a relativistic one. So we would have to write this down. But the problem is that it would look much more complicated. And I don't have this option of easy matching to basically do what we wanted to do. So yes, you're correct. In principle, this is something that one should look at, but I don't know if it's even possible to do that. So we had to make some kind of like reduction in complexity. They do find similar phases than we do. They just can't really say like how much the star has this phase.
Okay, so then the difference would be at high densities, I guess. I mean, in what phases do you expect that this would affect the most?
Well, so they basically like write down a model that you could in principle apply to everything. I would say it should, so because the entire core is like densities 10 to the 14 and higher, I would say in principle should affect everything that I talked about. But like the correction is probably like, it will just shift the actual like positions where what is. I don't think it will affect the full conclusion that we have mixed states. I think we can't really move away from that.
Okay.
I mean, even from like what I said, I mean, my caveats should like hopefully have convinced you that like there's a lot of like things that make this not like a per se predictable model. So if I measure like a critical field somehow ever in the future, then I can rule out an equational state. I don't think that's going to be possible. I think it's more like from like a macroscopic point of view, we need to start working on models that account for these kind of mixed phases.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? So I guess I'll ask one of mine. Well, I guess first as a comment, yes, let's talk about, you know, models that can include the equation of state and the pairing gaps, at least in a semi-consistent way. There are at least a couple that I can think of, in addition to the ones that I hope we can produce soon enough. And then I guess the second one would be, in this time-dependent, I mean, this time-dependent model to me resonates a little bit with what in nuclear physics would be a time-dependent density functional, right? So which you know, has been implemented in full three-dimensional glory, if you want. So you can, for instance, nowadays have a Wigner Zeitz and make it evolve in time and see how it reconfigures, how, you know, the pasta phase and everything works in there. Is that kind of what you have in mind, or are you looking more at a classical picture in which you average over distances, at least over these flux tubes?
So I think there's sort of two avenues that we're trying to look at. So Toby Toby's Toby Wood. He has already started working on like the same kind of picture that we have right now. So you basically have like a weakness sites picture. We have like one box and you try and like see what does the system do on like this microscopic scales. So this is something that he's been working on, and we've sort of started, or we already have some sort of preliminary calculations on doing this like in 3D with the Neutron vortices present. We don't have any results yet to sort of like suggest what this would do in like the picture where I actually have the electrons included, because as I said, it's not quite clear what's going on there. The question for me, so I think of this more in the astrophysics perspective, is like, what does it do anything to my system, right? So I'm like, I've started thinking a little bit more about this from like the macroscopic perspective, and I think we have to like meet sort of somewhere in the middle, because if I want to model like a glitch and like the effect of the glitch, for example, the vortices, how they interact with the flux tubes, I can't write down this on a Wigner Zeitz cell base, right? I have to have some approach that jumps from like, I don't know, Fermi to kilometer scales. And I think this is one of the problems that makes working on neutron stars really interesting, but also really tough, because we have no consistent description of like how I get from like a Fermi scale to something that's 10 kilometers and do this consistently. And I know that other people that look at this like from like, I don't know, a turbulence perspective, where you have like microscopic scales and you try and like average this out to like capture physics in some sense on large scales, they have like similar issues, but we don't even understand the microscopic scales that well. So I think I've like started a lot like trying to like find approaches how I can like bridge this gap in some sense. So I think we have to do both, because if I don't understand microscopic physics at all, how am I supposed to model like the macroscopic scales? But we also don't have a way to like consistently make that step. So I think there's like a lot of like thinking going on right now on how one could even do that.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, of course. Yes. That mesoscopic level in between is all that important, and no one really knows how to go about it. Any other questions for Vanessa?
Igual jo en tinc una, si és que em sents.
Sí, Xavi, et sentim.
Al final he pogut entrar, però he entrat agafant un altre ordinador i al final. Excuse me, I have a question for you.
Yes.
Sorry, but I lost almost all your seminar by technical reasons, and maybe you explained this before.
I'm happy to repeat, even if I did.
Which pairing interaction you use in all these things? You use a delta force, or what do you use?
Okay, I'm going to say I don't know, because what I really do is I use someone else's calculation of gaps. So maybe someone in the audience knows exactly what these two gaps use.
I should. The K is quo in there, and TOA I can't remember, but
those are the two Japanese people.
Yeah,
but I don't know the answer, and I mean, in some sense, this already tells you how like.
But if you solve the gap equation with BCS, let's say, or LDA, doesn't matter very much.
Yeah.
at the level of infinite system, you need some interaction, let's say delta force or Gaussian interaction or whatever, or you don't
Xavi,
use
so
anything of this.
This is separated. They just input some gaps that come from the literature. It's a
They don't
parameterization of the. It's not calculated within the Skyrme force, or with the.
No, but the Skyrme will not give the gap because the Skyrme is not designed for that.
Right.
Yes.
But it's
only can give the energy density of the system or something like that, but nothing to do with pairing. But you take the pairing from another calculation, external calculation, and so on. Okay.
And this is actually not just something that I do. I think there is not a single neutron star model on any kind of physics that does this consistently. Like every time you see someone put in numbers into a neutron star model, this will be picked and matched what they need to calculate some macroscopic model, because sometimes it's not available. People are only sort of just talking about this, but it's really like never done in a consistent way. So we just follow this approach.
Yeah. In this respect, the Skyrme force and the pairing interaction that you use has nothing to do one with the other, no? In principle.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it has it's not consistent at all.
Okay, thank you very much.
But if you have calculated some of these numbers, and I could just use that in principle, like we can in principle adapt, right? So like this is really modular in some sense, and I just need numbers for coefficients. And this is the same thing very often for like, if I do glitch calculations, I need the composition of the crust, I need the composition of the interior, I need numbers as a function of density. But like in principle, once I have this, I can calculate and generalize. But if I don't have this consistently done, then the only thing I could do to get some estimate is use something that I know is not consistent but I don't really have another option at this point, I think, is the answer. But yes, you're perfectly correct. I didn't even know what the interaction is in that case. So
okay,
yes.
Thank you very much.
Good, then I guess if there are no more, are there any other questions from the audience? Otherwise, I will just stop the recording here then.